Hello, my name is Mahan. I'm an Irish philosophy PhD researcher and a part-time lecturer in philosophy and ethics. This lecture is the first of a series of 11 lectures on Plato's Republic, arguably the greatest work of Western literature, the greatest work of Western philosophy, first work of political science, cognitive psychology, and one of the main foundational texts of Western civilization. Over these 11 lectures, I'm going to go through each book of the Republic in detail, exploring the different philosophical ideas in them and the quest that ties it all together, the nature of justice, which could be translated better as our word morality. The Republic is Plato's attempt to ground morality in something other than the Homeric mythology and the encroaching relativism of the Greek scientific revolution. What does ancient Athens have to do with the modern age? Why should you, as a modern person, care about the Republic? Philosophy itself had begun just before Plato, with a group of philosophers referred to as the natural philosophers in the 6th and 5th century in Greece, particularly around Ionia. The natural philosophers rejected the Homeric mythic explanations and sought to explain phenomena naturalistically. Famous example of this was Thales, who was one of the first philosophers in the West who was able to predict an eclipse. And so this was a beginning of a new way of understanding nature, not as imbued with gods, but instead trying to focus on explaining the mechanics of things. Plato understood that this burgeoning scientific revolution posed a threat to the myths and stories that grounded cosmic justice that the Athenian morality and law was based on. People were just because they thought there was an afterlife, that there would be consequences, and that vice was punished and virtue was rewarded by the gods. If there was no gods and everything was mechanical in a sense, then what was to stop people from behaving viciously rather than virtuously? At the time of Plato's upbringing, there was a lot of political chaos in Athens. Athens had a great empire initially, was taking over a lot of countries, very powerful, and then lost to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War and became essentially a subjugated state. It was a brutal war, the Peloponnesian War, that shattered many of the norms of traditional combat. Post-Peloponnesian War, Athens was ruled by a group called the 30 Tyrants, a Spartan-backed oligarchy. Plato and Socrates actually supported, seeing that the decadencies of Athenian democracy had driven the thirst for conquest that ruined them in terms of their ever-expanding empire that got too big for its own good. Slightly later than the natural philosophers, another breed of philosophers started to emerge in ancient Greece. These teachers were called the Sophists, and they were professional teachers of rhetoric. Their job was to teach people the art of persuasion, to influence people's behavior, and they weren't particularly concerned with the truth. These days, they'd be like professional debating coaches or bullshitters, to use Harry Frankfurt's term, which teach people how to win at arguments without any real concern for whether the arguments are true or false. The philosophy of the Sophists was, if there's no gods and there's no cosmic justice, winners are going to win and losers are going to lose. Wouldn't you rather be a winner than a loser? Wouldn't you rather be a lion than a sheep? We're going to teach you how to beat everybody in arguments. One of the most famous sophists, Protagoras, summed up the philosophy of the Sophists in his phrase, "Man is the measure of all things." Essentially, there's no reality. Everything is subjective, and so we make it up as we go along. This opens the door to relativism. And this was a big problem for Plato, in that the people who were training the most powerful people and becoming very powerful themselves didn't care about the truth at all. They were becoming more and more influential, but less and less rational and wise. So combining these two types of philosophy for Plato, the natural philosophers that were essentially undercutting the Homeric and Hesiod myths, the sophists that were arming people with very powerful arguments but didn't care about the truth at all, very dangerous situation coupled with the political chaos of ancient Athens. In summary, ancient Athens was undergoing what John Verveake calls a meaning crisis. The old gods were being called into question by a scientific revolution that threatened the foundations of morality, truth, and knowledge itself. The political chaos was leading to questions about governance, democracies versus tyrannies. Moral relativism had led to a very Machiavellian culture in the Sophists, in that people weren't concerned about truth, they were more concerned with becoming powerful and influencing other people's behavior, not unlike our own internet society. Part 2, the meaning crisis. This is about our current context in the 21st century, philosophically, theologically. We're living in this post-God world that Nietzsche announced at the end of the 19th century. The Aristotelian Christian worldview that was the dominant framework for the last 2,000 years has been undercut by a mechanistic model of the universe, one that doesn't include things like value, consciousness, or ethics, and has created a version of reality in which human beings are epiphenomenal. that we are not made in the image of God, and destabilized the sense of human value. Arguably, the ideological wars of the 20th century are wars for political supremacy in a world without a unified account of reality. Big picture ideologies that clash and claim to offer solutions to our very existential problems politically or economically. Plato's solution to these problems isn't a specifically political or economic solution, although he does talk about politics. More so, it is a theological, an ethical, psychological solution. So what is a meaning crisis? A meaning crisis is the collapse of a worldview that makes sense of our lives. It gives us a sense of purpose and ability to normatively evaluate our progress. The idea originates from Canadian cognitive scientist John Verveake in his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series. Literature on the psychology of meaning in life has three dimensions in coherence, purpose, and significance. As we dive into this tripartite model of meaning in life, it'll be easy to see how these three very significant dimensions are under threat in the modern world. The first is coherence, which is that your life makes sense to you. It's very hard to have a coherent worldview in such a multicultural, multi-faith, multi-religious, globally connected, instant communicating, to have a coherent model of reality. Everybody says one thing and other people say something else. Coherence is very difficult under the current paradigm. The second dimension is purpose, a higher order goal or narrative to pursue in your life. The question of narrative now is really reified in a distinction between fact and fiction, that there's a world of mind-independent facts and then fictional things that aren't real, which would be very alien to an ancient culture. In a scientific society that's non-teleological, there isn't an overarching narrative or goal to pursue to human life. Existentialism philosophically was a project to kind of weld a goal onto life that we could pursue meaning making like Jean-Paul Sartre, but a lot of that ends up just like Camus' Sisyphus of rolling a boulder up a hill. A mechanistic account of the universe precludes a transcendent purpose or any teleological explanations. So purpose is another dimension under threat. The third dimension of meaning in life is significance, that your life is connected to something real and valuable. Under a materialist reductionist paradigm, what is real is what is reducible to the lowest level of reality. It's very hard to account for the value of human lives under that worldview. What are the consequences of the meaning crisis? Not having a stable worldview leads to increased volatility and chaos experienced as stress and difficulty, a rise of existential issues such as nihilism, alienation, despair, anxiety, purposelessness, addiction, fuels a mental health crisis and creates a market for many pseudo-religious ideologies that make sense of one's life, provide a sense of purpose and a path of progress, but often turn into manipulative, weird sex cults that aren't good for people. Arguably, this is our context, and it's as chaotic as Plato's was at the fall of the golden age of Athens. Plato's quest to root morality in something solid can offer us some insights into our own reeling worldview. In summary, in the West, the dominant Aristotelian Christian worldview is undercut by the scientific revolution. Science provides a mechanistic account of the universe that does not explain consciousness, value, action, or ethics. Hence, we get a split between science and mythology. The wars of the 20th century were about the dominance of a particular ideology, a low-resolution story of reality. We're still in that competing space where different ideologies are fighting one another. The divide between science and mythology, fact and value, is not healed, and bad actors sell pseudo-religious ideologies to offer the dimensions and meaning to people that are ultimately self-destructive. Part 3. The Greek solution. Socrates, Plato and Aristotle had a solution to the meaning crisis, which is to become rational and wise. Socrates, at his apology speech where he was defending himself when he was put on trial for charges of corrupting the youth and worshipping false gods, said, "Are you not ashamed, citizens of Athens, to be pursuing money, reputation and honour, placing no value at all upon wisdom and truth and the care of your souls, and ensuring that your souls will be as good as they can be?" The alternative to the pseudo-religious ideologies is moral self-cultivation. It's taking on the responsibility of becoming transformed, of your character. And Plato provides a roadmap for that, very much integrated with his moral philosophy, with his psychology, with his theology, in a way that's incredibly powerful once you understand it. In this section, we're going to delve into the Greek solution a little bit. To introduce you to one of our main characters of this story is Socrates. Socrates lived from 471 BC to 399 BC. His father was a stonemason, his mother was a midwife. He was not very good looking. He was kind of fat. He had bulging eyes. But he was a very brave man and he was very honest. He was a veteran of the Peloponnesian War. He saved up and bought his own hoplite armor so he could fight in the infantry and proved himself as a hero, saving the life of one Alcibiades. Socrates isn't famous for his military career. The aspect of philosophy which we know him best for is the father of Western philosophy and really of changing the nature of philosophy. And so Socrates began this quest to understand wisdom whenever the Oracle of Delphi told a friend of his that Socrates is the wisest of all men. And Socrates was very thrown by this because he knew he didn't have any wisdom. So why would the Oracle of Delphi, which directed the Greek world from its center, Delphi, the Omphalamus, which is literally the navel of the world, why would she say that Socrates was the wisest of all men when he in fact knew he had no wisdom? This started a quest for Socrates to go and speak to people who were considered to be wise because he knew he didn't have any wisdom, so maybe somebody else did. And then he quickly found out as he spoke to the supposedly wise people of his day that they didn't know any more than he did. Whenever he would question a military general about courage, he would find out that he didn't really know a definition of courage, or he would ask someone about piety and it turns out they don't know what piety is. Socrates realized that the reason he was the wisest of all men was that he knew he didn't know anything, whereas these other people thought they knew something and actually didn't. So they had a kind of double ignorance, whereas Socrates had a single ignorance in the sense that he at least knew that he didn't know anything. This Socratic method of questioning people to almost strip away their assumptions to get to a state of what's called aporia, just completely hitting the wall intellectually, was actually an improvement for Socrates. He thought that was his job in Athens, to go around asking people questions, to get to the bedrock of their assumptions, to show people that we didn't really know the things that we thought we knew. That was actually moral progress. Socrates came between the ancient Greek philosophers, the natural philosophers who wanted truth without wisdom, and the Sophists, power without truth. He wants power and knowledge combined. Francis Bacon's famous quote, knowledge is power. For Plato and Socrates, knowledge is not power. Knowledge is knowledge, power is power. Oftentimes the people in power don't have knowledge, and the people with knowledge don't have any power. Socrates transforms philosophy. He focuses on ethics, how best to live, and his solution to the chaos of Athens is to become rational and wise and criticize science and mythology properly, to understand reality, to self-realize. This is his third way between the obstacles faced in ancient Greece. Fortunately, he didn't get very far with it because he was put to death by the Athenian democracy. In ancient Greece, there was a clash of values at the time. Because the 30 tyrants had been overthrown and the Athenian democracy restored, they wanted order. They wanted to really consolidate their power. And unfortunately, this guy Socrates, the gadfly of Athens, was going around asking very inconvenient questions to people. Socrates was essentially put up on charges of corrupting the youth and atheism, of worshipping false gods, which he denied very famously. You can read it in Plato's Apology. And so he's put on trial, and the trial was a fix. It wasn't meant to kill Socrates. It was meant to scare him, to stop him from doing philosophy and potentially get him to leave Athens. Socrates refused. He said, I'm not going to leave. I'm not going to stop doing philosophy. He said, the unexamined life is not worth living. Very famous quote, which makes Socrates a kind of philosophical martyr. Socrates' friends tried to convince him to leave. He explained to them that he had a daemon, a voice that told him when not to do something, and that he'd always listened to this voice. Maybe that was the thing that separated him from other men, that he was guided by this higher order angel or guardian spirit of some sort. Whenever he asked the daemon if he should run away from the trial, it said that he shouldn't. His conclusion was he'd had a good life, that, it was going to end at some point. He was 70 years old. And so this was the end of the road for him. He was put to death by drinking hemlock. Somebody was present at this time, one of his students who loved him very dearly, in the form of Plato. Plato was 25. And he was so traumatized by the death of Socrates that he left Athens altogether, a city which he loved, and went traveling. And we can see that he comes back to this again and again. The main body of his dialogues feature Socrates as the main character. And Socrates is, for him, the epitome of a wise and just and good person. He is the ideal. And so he's trying to grapple with the issue of how the city that he loved could put to death the guy who was the best. A theme that we'll see played out in Christianity later as well, with the death of Christ in Rome. that the most virtuous, the most just person can be put to death in the most unjust and cruel ways. And how can you square this? How can you square that the people in power put to death the guy with the knowledge? And we see this in the Republic again and again. How do you get the people in power to have knowledge? How do you get the people with knowledge to be in power? The solution Plato comes up with is the philosopher kings, which we'll obviously discuss later in Book 5 and Book 6 of the Republic. To introduce Plato, Plato lived 427, 428 BC to 348. He was born named Aristocles, meaning best reputation. He gets the nickname Plato from his wrestling coach, which means broad, because he was very big and he broad head, which was good for wrestling. He came from a very wealthy family. He was a descendant from kings. Initially, as a youngster, he wanted to be a dramatist, but burned all his plays after meeting Socrates. He really wanted to be like Socrates. I mean, he thought Socrates was the best. And he was a committed follower of him, so that's why his death had such a profound effect on him. And really, I think, motivates a lot of us, his quest to understand in the dialogues. At the age of 40, he started the first university in the world, the Academy, where he trained Aristotle, who then later went on to train Alexander the Great, quite a legacy. But after Plato's death, really, there's a lot of conflict around Plato's legacy. Share this quote from Olympidoros, where he says, when he was about to die, Plato saw in a dream that he had become a swan, moving from tree to tree, and in this way caused much trouble to the bird catchers. Simmias, the Socratic, judged from this that he would not be captured by those desiring to interpret him. Plato writes in dialogue form. He doesn't write treatises or monographs like a lot of modern philosophers or essays. These are both literary and philosophical. He wrote nearly 40 dialogues. Some would argue that these dialogues form a system and that Plato's making arguments in them and that you can logically evaluate these arguments in and of themselves, like modern philosophy. And this is what first wave Platonism pretty much did, with very little success. If you take out the arguments out of their context, a lot of the times they don't make sense. They're not really very good arguments. And you really miss the point of what Plato is actually talking about. This kind of led to second wave Platonism, which is that dialogues are purely skeptical, rhetorical, literary. They're not actually meant to be like philosophy. You shouldn't evaluate them for truth claims. And this kind of, again, I think lowers it to just some slightly dodgy literary works by Plato that, plays that if you put them on stage, put people to sleep. So there's a lot of questions about interpreting Plato. The frame that I'm going to use for this series is third wave. Third wave Platonism argues that Plato's philosophy is not separable from the dramatic form. The fact that a character blushes is just as important as what the character says. So Plato's dialogue is an argument, but it's not just in each line of dialogue or in each scene or in each beat. The dialogue demonstrates the dialectical method, the journey we have to undertake ourselves. This dialectical method is summed up in the myth of the cave, which is a myth of enlightenment, which we'll meet in Book 7. The point is that you can't separate the literary from the philosophical in Plato. The fact that it's a story, that's dialogue, is very important to the interpretation of it. And so throughout the series, we're going to pay attention to that, to the bits of dialogue and to the essential narrative quality of the story. I'm going to rely a lot on this book by DC Schindler, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, as a secondary source. It's an absolutely amazing book. Perhaps after reading the Republic, it would be good to go on to study it because it is really brilliant. I'm using this copy of the Republic by Alan Bloom, but also the GMA Grube edition, which is the most typical one you find in the complete works of Plato, is a very good translation. So in summary, in part 3, the Socratic solution to the Athenian meaning crisis is to become rational and wise, criticize both myths and science properly. But then Athens puts him to death. This guy was on track to sort us out and you killed him. So Plato takes on the Socratic educational mission, but also with this problem of politics, of the polis, and the conflict between truth and power, which obviously comes to fruition in the Republic. As Plato searches for a cosmic grounding for truth to refute moral relativism, but then also the old polytheistic tradition of Athens, to introduce a kind of monotheism beyond that. In summary, my argument for the relevance of Plato's Republic is that Athens was undergoing a meaning crisis at the same time. We are undergoing a meaning crisis where we have this powerful scientific revolution that's undercut a lot of the mythologies that were grounding virtue and vice, character, justice, morality itself. we can learn from this Platonic dialogue a way out to become wiser, more rational in order to understand science and mythology in its place. And so what I would argue is that Plato offers us a way out of the meaning crisis. That is a return, but also is probably new to most people. So over the next 11 lectures, I'm going to go through the Republic book by book, introduce the main ideas for you. If you go to the Wisdom Dojo Substack, in the introductory email, I have a PDF copy of the book that you can use. To recommend getting a hard copy of it. But yeah, over the next 10 lectures after this one, we're going to explore all of the aspects of the Republic. So hopefully see you there.